Hello and welcome to the apiary. Today we're going to talk about European Foulbrood. I actually have one of my classroom presentations on European Foulbrood. European Foulbrood is an increasingly present problem in our region, and there's a lot to learn about it. So with that, let's go ahead and get straight to the presentation. All right, this is my presentation on infectious larval gut diseases, which I call Melissococcus Complex. This is about European Foulbrood, Snotbrood, and the associated Sacbrood that we encounter with these things. This picture on the right is a pretty classic picture of European Foulbrood. You have the yellowing larvae in it. We'll talk a lot more about identifying this stuff as we go through here. We're going to have an introduction on this. We'll talk about Melissococcus itself. Then we'll talk about European Foulbrood for quite a while and all the challenges it presents us. Now, I am your speaker. I'm Jacob B. Man Barker. I'm an ES and Cornell Master Beekeeper. I run around 125 hives. It varies from 100 to 150 seasonally in the greater Louisville area for honey, queens, nukes, you name it. Now, getting into this, here's my YouTube page. If you're somehow not familiar with this page, please like and subscribe it. That is what shows it, my videos, to others with the algorithm on YouTube. So, introduction. Let's talk about Melissococcus. In the mad dash to study Varroa Destructor and everything else over the last 30 years, we've kind of ignored everything else. We've been looking at Varroa, we've been looking at the diseases related with Varroa, but if it's not Varroa or Tropy for that matter, we haven't really looked at it. And during this time, other diseases have flourished without us examining them or understanding them or studying them. In particular, Melissococcus has evolved into different strains, finding new ways to confound detection and treatment. With the Veterinary Feed Directive, which came into effect in 2017, Melissococcus and its associated diseases are among the most uncontrolled and least understood threats in our apiaries. We have a lack of domestic and international expertise regarding European Foulbrood. We have Michigan State, Megan Milbrath and her lab have been doing some work on European Foulbrood. University of Saskatchewan in Canada has been doing some good work, and there's also the National Bee Unit in the United Kingdom. I literally have slides in this presentation from the National Bee Unit because they are a big group doing a lot of good work on European Foulbrood. I also have some slides from Michigan State's office hours in here. There'll be links to them in the description. Absolutely seek them out for further reading. Now, Melissococcus is a bacteria spread by nurse bees feeding contaminated food to larvae. Day 2 to 3 old larvae, which is going to be your first instar before they've molted, this is 5 to 6 days after the egg is laid, are the most susceptible. It rapidly colonizes the gut, and this is the first stage of European Foulbrood. You can see with these pictures, B has the initial infection, C it's spreading, D, it pretty much takes over the gut of the larvae, and the larvae is pretty much all gut, so this is a very significant infection. On this slide, we see two kind of suspect-looking yellow larvae in a colony, and when they're worked between your fingers, you can actually express out the intestines. And that clump of yellow in that intestine in the bottom right picture with the arrow pointed at it is literally the Melissococcus plutonius. It is the infectious bacteria. And it can vary in appearance. This brown stuff here, that's the Melissococcus in this one. And this is a huge amount of bacteria to spread in a hive, which really explains how it can be so infectious to a colony. Now, I said it happens on day 2 to 3 larvae, which is day 5 to 6 from the egg being laid. It's around this age the larva becomes infected. This is the larva you would graft with. Its mortality usually happens towards the end of the uncapped cycle, around day 8. Keep in mind they're uncapped right at, 9 days, day 9 to get capped. So right towards the end of the uncapping cycle is where mortality usually shows up. But it can be a little confusing because the dying larvae just doesn't get as big. In this image, A is a healthy larva at day 6, B is a sick larva at day 6. What happens is the larvae is competing with the bacteria in its gut for its food. It effectively is starving, even though it's being fed robustly by the nurse bees, and it just kind of withers away. And you can kind of see again how much that bacteria just takes over the intestine on these things. Now, European Foulbrood is caused by Melissococcus plutonius. It's technically a dysbiosis. Dysbiosis is an imbalance of gut bacteria. Too much of the wrong bacteria, in this case Melissococcus, or not enough of the right bacteria. They can be caused by different things, but they all present similarly because they're all dysbioses. Dysbiosis causes larval death by starvation. So again, you're seeing starving larvae. Different things can cause starving larvae, and they'll all look relatively the same. EFB causes death to non-capped larvae, and the larvae decompose in the cell until it's removed by house bees. Now, that's not a wholly accurate statement. It can kill cap larvae. You can have some strains of this stuff that just goes longer. Um, and the removal by house bees can be highly variable. Some hygienic colonies get rid of it immediately. Other ones let it sit there till it dries out and never get around to it. Now, larvae that survive and become adults are infected with the European Foulbrood still, and they discharge it in their feces, and that can reinfect the colony. The adults, unfortunately, are asymptomatic. You cannot visually identify a adult bee that is sick with European Foulbrood. It is a notifiable disease in the United Kingdom. It is also notifiable in the state of Kentucky, but not in Indiana. This is one of those state-based rule things. You're going to have to find out from your apiarist if you need to report EFB or not. It is on some of the USDA forms your apiarist fills out every month. That's why we do it in Kentucky, but not everyone is forcing that rule set. Now, the infection is spread through a couple of different mechanisms. Within a hive, it could be feces from infected adults. You know, they try not to poo in the hive, but sometimes stuff happens, and it can infect the colony that way. It can also be contaminated food brought in and fed to larvae, or food from sick adults fed to larvae. It's also spread between hives. It can be spread by robbing events when you have a sick colony collapse the EFB. It can be caused by drift. If I have an EFB hive in my apiary, the next most likely hives to have it are its immediate neighbors. It can be spread by sharing equipment. Equipment that has active EFB infections are highly infectious. If it has the sick larva on it, highly infectious. It can also even be incidental, like flower visitation. If you have a bee land on a flower that's sick with EFB, they're going to park some of that Melissococcus on that flower, and the next bee that comes along is going to pick it up. And more troublingly is the spread between apiaries and within apiaries. They did this study where they had a hive with a known infection. Well, within 10 meters of that hive, 95% of the other hives had infections as well. So if there's a hive in an apiary that has it and there's other hives within 10 meters, 95% of them will have detectable Melissococcus infections. Within 500 meters to 1,000 meters, that's a half mile, a quarter mile to a half mile roughly. 40% had detectable Melissococcus infections. Even beyond a half mile, 14% had detectable infections. This really means the disease spreads rapidly within a region and can be endemic through a region, which is what we're really witnessing today. There's always the question of, can Varroa spread this thing? Varroa is blamed for spreading a lot of diseases in the hive. Does it play a role in European Foulbrood? Most viruses aren't really effective through ingestion. There's exceptions, like hepatitis. Is that a virus? I don't even know. But EFB is one of the ones that's primarily spread through oral transmission. A lot of the stuff spread by the Varroa destructor virus are spread through injecting directly into the hemolymph, like a hypodermic needle, because that's how the mite feeds. And there's a boatload of diseases spread by the Varroa destructor, including acute bee paralysis virus. We'll come back to that one. Now, other viruses like Sacbrood and black queen cell virus have been found in Varroa, but the Varroa hasn't been shown to transmit it. So the Varroa can carry viruses and diseases in and of itself. Some viruses, like the deformed wing virus, have actually been shown to multiply inside Varroa mice. That really means the Varroa can't have a deformed wing virus infection, and that can cause some real trouble for our bees. Now, that said, we don't really see a smoking gun here for EFB transmission until we talk about Varroa's behavior. Varroa feeds on bees by cutting a hole in their exoskeleton and creates a wound. And if you swab those wounds, you find Melissococcus. So there's very real chance that Varroa is helping Melissococcus colonize these colonies because it's on all of these wounds that are in the bees. So where has Foulbrood come from? Odds are we've had it all along. In Aristotle's History of Animals, which is, 2,400 years ago, he talks about bees being lazy and smelly. The hive smelling bad as a disease of the bees. That's Foulbrood if there ever was one. In 1771, we have the first record of the phrase Foulbrood, named so after the stench of the decomposing larvae. Now keep in mind, this is where we started to switch into like gentleman beekeeping and scientific beekeeping, and not just subsistence agriculture beekeeping. 1885, the bacterial source of Foulbrood first identified, and the ability to transfer Foulbrood was shown. They identified a bacteria they called Bacillus alvi. They later figured out it was actually two different things. Keep in mind, 1885, this is where we were really having, movable frame hives and leaf frame hives and stuff coming into the fore, and we really started learning about the mechanisms within the hive. In 1906, American Foulbrood was first isolated, and they realized at that point there's actually two different kinds of Foulbrood, and European Foulbrood would be isolated the next year. They are named American and European based on the continents they were isolated on initially, not where they're found. To my knowledge, AFB and EFB can be found anywhere there are European honeybees. So why do I always want to talk about European Foulbrood? Because it's becoming a bigger problem. This is from the USDA on sample data they have been building over the years, and we see a couple trends. Let's look at the right side of the slide first. Basically, they've had positive samples triple over the last 7 years. That is a huge increase. We see a seasonality to it. You'll see this bow hoop for the monthly chart here. That's where the bees are rearing brood. This is a disease that is highly specific to the brood, so it's not really a surprise we see more of it during brood rearing. Now, there's also a regionality to it, and I'm in the Ohio Valley region. We've got a bad bit of EFB around here. Roughly 30% of samples sent to the USDA had EFB in them, which is huge numbers. To give you an idea, this is what the Ohio Valley looks like. I'm somewhat near the center of that clump. It's a broad expanse that has EFB problems. The only people worse than us are the states to our south. But that really doesn't tell the whole story. This is a study that came out of Michigan in 2023. It's well known within migratory beekeeping and commercial beekeeping that if you put bees on blueberries, you're going to have European Foulbrood problems afterwards. And they ran parallel studies to figure this out, or at least start to address it. They had holding yards that did not have blueberry pollination, and they had yards that had blueberry pollination. And what they found is this steady march and huge increase in European Foulbrood. By late June, 60% of colonies had detectable Foulbrood in them, and half of them had moderate to severe infections. This is huge numbers. And part of what's driving this is these are scientists that know what European actually looks like and how to identify it, which is why they're able to show so huge numbers of infection in these colonies. The other important thing to take from this is it wasn't so much blueberries causing the Foulbrood as much as it's the time of year and the heavy brooding that coincides with it that we see this spike of Foulbrood activity. But this is just huge numbers. 60% of colonies had the European Foulbrood. It is a hugely impactful disease that causes millions of dollars of damages every year in weak colonies. So let's talk about what European Foulbrood actually looks like, because I'm willing to bet if you have any significant number of hives or been beekeeping for a while, you've seen it, you just didn't know what it was. Early signs of the disease. You'll see larvae that's still white. Turning yellow is a pretty classic color change that happens as the disease progresses. But the big thing to look for, in my opinion, are the two in the top slide. The one on the right is the larvae kind of twisting on itself. I call this the stomachache twist. It kind of looks like someone shoved a croissant into that cell. Anytime the larvae is not on the bottom or back of the cell, there's something wrong in there, unless you drop that frame. The larvae in the middle bottom of the upper picture is slumping. It's losing its segmentation. It looks less plump. A healthy larva kind of has that mandarin orange segmentation appearance that's really pronounced. When they get sick, they tend to slouch and slump, and they kind of puddle out. That's what we're seeing there. As the disease progresses, you'll see color changes come in. You'll see the larvae kind of melt into a puddle on the bottom wall of the cell. You can see nibbled cappings. You'll see a shotgun brood pattern frequently with these colonies. Now, this is something unique to EFB to our knowledge. This is tracheal flash. You'll notice the larvae on the right side are turning very brown, but you can see what looks like a skeleton in there. That is the trachea. And this is something unique to European Foulbrood to our knowledge. You'll have that show up. That's a pretty good indicator as European Foulbrood if you see that in a colony, but not all EFB colonies will have it. They have their laser pointer pointing at a fully slumped larvae. That's how the scale forms. Basically, the larva melts away and it dries out and forms what we call a scale. It looks more like a scab to me. And we can see some other pretty, in my opinion, classic expressions of Foulbrood on this frame. The bottom left, we have these slumped larvae on the bottom wall. Bottom right, we have that larvae there, and that's kind of a classic color, in my opinion, that you can encounter with these hives. But the colors can be different based on secondary infections, and that can throw a lot of people off. This slide is from Michigan State's office hours presentation, and I highly recommend it for further viewing. Now, what the textbook said EFB looks like and what we actually see can vary a lot. In the textbook, they describe the melting, browning, tracheal flash that we just saw in the last slide. But the problem is larvae can be removed by hygienic bees at a rapid pace, and you won't have much sick larvae to look at. It's often described as an old equipment condition. It's definitely found on new equipment. It's described as a spring condition, cold and damp weather. That's true to an extent, but anytime they're rearing brood, you can have European Foulbrood show up. And historically, we'd expect hives to recover spontaneously with pollen and nectar flow. I have found that's just not the case. These colonies carry this infection and will dwindle and die without intervention more times than not. This was my first case of European Foulbrood. This was a frame put into service that year, so it's brand new equipment effectively. And it had this shotgun pattern. And unless you went through a bunch of frames, you wouldn't find the individual sick larvae. Notice I'm pointing at a slumped larvae in the cell there, and there's another slumped larvae to the right. This is European Foulbrood, and this is honestly more often what it looks like today because our bees are hygienic. They clear the stuff out usually faster than you can see it. I'm willing to bet the bees can detect the European Foulbrood in the sick larvae before the sick larvae expresses the signs and symptoms we look for, which can aggravate this even further. This is a pic of EFB and Sacbrood in the same hive. This is what Sacbrood actually looks like, not the red water balloon that we see in the bee books. What happens with Sacbrood is the larvae can't shed its last shell. It turns into a balloon, more or less, and it traps it while it tries to pupate. And that's why we have this shrunken bee face on the end of this case of Sacbrood here. That's what's going on there. But Sacbrood and EFB, this is EFB and the cells beneath it, often appear in the same colonies. Or one can lead the other. Now, there's a lot of things that make EFB diagnosis difficult. I'll try to just skim through these because it can get pretty deep pretty fast. First one is the infection occurs in series. Melissococcus plutonius, the thing that causes EFB, is the initial infection, but secondary infections rapidly displace the Melissococcus. The Melissococcus is living on food fed to the bees. The Melissococcus is living on brood food. When that larva dies, the brood food stops, and the things that eat on the larva itself come in and become the infections. Most of these signs of infection that we know to look for, the discoloration, the browning, or the odor is kind of akin to sour milk or a trash can in my experience, are really caused by the secondary infections and not the Melissococcus. There are field tests out there for it that are specifically designed to detect Melissococcus, but here's a hinky. Larvae with the highest concentration of Melissococcus appear barely sick. They're the white larvae that's twisting on itself or just starting to lose segmentation. As you go to the larvae that are obviously sick and dying, a lot of them are deep into the secondary infections and no longer have detectable levels of Melissococcus, which means if you use a Melissococcus test kit, the lateral flow device, the thing that looks like a pregnancy test, it's going to give you a false negative on those older larvae. And this is another slide from Michigan State. And the top left is a healthy larvae, and the rest are different EFB expressions. And the red box is around the larvae that might show positive on a lateral flow device. If you test any of these obviously sick larvae towards the bottom with the Melissococcus test kit, it's going to show negative because there's not Melissococcus in here anymore. It's all secondary infections. And this traps and trips up a lot of people. You have to sample larvae that look barely infected. Differing strains of Melissococcus combined with differing secondary infections and hygienic responses can make EFB look very different apiary to apiary and hive to hive. Examples of conditions I have seen personally, well, there's classic expression, which you can still encounter, where you'll have the melting brown larvae, tracheal flash, and rubbery scales, but that's a rarity. You can have cryptic expression, which is the young white larvae twisting on itself and that first loss of segmentation, and melting white larvae, where it's not quite smoking gun EFB, but that's really what it is. It's Melissococcus. The most common one I actually see is also the hardest one to diagnose, and that's the hygienic expression, where you'll encounter a shotgun brood pattern by a minority of discoverable sick larvae. That's because those hygienic bees are getting that sick larvae out of there in a hurry. They know something's wrong with it and they're getting rid of it, and I'm willing to bet they're getting rid of larvae that doesn't even look sick to our eyes. And you have to go through entire hives to find sick larvae in these things. I've gone through a 20-frame hive that had this hygienic expression problem going on, and I found one sick larva in the whole hive. I was able to use a lateral flow test device on it to confirm it was EFB, but it really can just be a spotty pattern. That also means if you find a spotty pattern in a hygienic hive, you're going to have to dig through there to make sure it's not EFB. Now this is a case of the hygienic expression. This is a spotty frame with my bees. Your bees might have frames that look like this on the regular. My bees can have whole sheets of brood. So this qualifies as a spotty frame in my operation. And if we take a closer look at this, we see a couple larvae that are just a little questionable. Like the color doesn't quite seem right on a couple of them. The ones on the left just don't seem quite right. The top right one's twisting on itself. I think that's a smoking gun indicator for European Foulbrood. And then we have the larvae that's fully slumped and something's happening to it, but it hasn't turned color yet. So to confirm this, I would use a lateral flow test device if I could get one to see if it is in fact European Foulbrood or not. But then comes the question of which larvae do we test? Well, the two on the left, they might be healthy. It might be my eyes playing tricks on me. I might be looking for a problem where there isn't one. The ones on the right, definitely something's going on with them. The one on the bottom's too far gone, though, to have a EFB test kit used on it. So I'm going to test the top right one. And, in fact, I did. And this was positive for European Foulbrood. So I could safely assume at this point the spottiness in this hive was European Foulbrood caused, and I could then deal with that. Now, going further, with diagnosing EFB, if you don't have a lateral flow device or whatever else, you can do lab analysis. You can send a sample to Beltsville for free, or if you have someone with the kit and a microscope and the dyes, you can do it yourself. It is a bit intensive to do. Problem with this is long turnaround time. Like if you send samples to Beltsville, you're not going to get results back for weeks. And that's fine for post-mortem analysis. It's no good for trying to do management. So it's just a challenge there. We also have the same issue with Melissococcus' short shelf life. The reality is with microscopy methods, you don't look for Melissococcus, you look for the secondary infections, which also means we're dependent on those secondary infections being there to say it's Melissococcus, even though we don't see the Melissococcus itself. It can cause an unpredictable infection appearances. It seems totally random. Stochastic primal infections or herald waves. The first infections in your apiary are unpredictable. Like when we talk about mites, we know if you go into an apiary and there's 5 hives and 2 of them are huge, check those ones for mites first, because that's where your mite problem is going to be 9 times out of 10. We don't have that with Melissococcus. It can show up anywhere. And that's because a lot of times It's just a random stressor that's hitting that hive or a random event that caused that hive to become sick with European Foulbrood. Maybe they robbed another hive that collapsed from EFB. Maybe their bees were working the same flowers as an EFB hive and they suddenly have EFB. You don't know it unless you're in that hive and you see it. That said, there are predictable secondary infections from that colony, or a second wave of infections, where the most likely colonies to be infected with EFB in your apiary, besides your one positive hive, are the hives immediately next to it. It definitely has drift issues. If you have a robbing event with the EFB hive, you're going to have more of them in your apiary. Now, another challenge is EFB has several mimics. If it causes dysbiosis, it can look like EFB. That can be caused by fungicides, like apples getting hit with fungicides can totally cause some EFB. Looking things, if you have bees on watermelons, they're getting hit with everything. And you can have all sorts of problems show up, including dysbiosis that looks like EFB. A quick little side note, acute bee paralysis virus, one of the things spread by Varroa Destructor, can instigate or aggravate dysbiosis. So there's something there to think about with these Varroa and the EFB and other things that look like it. Now, parasitic mite syndrome can definitely look like EFB. You just get a lot of brood abandonment and just high disease levels in that brood that causes brood mortality. But anything that causes abandoned brood, like chilled brood or poor nurse bee populations from long-term queenlessness or laying worker problems, can cause things that look like EFB to happen. Now, the National Bee Unit has this slide on parasitic mite syndrome. The easy way to tell if it's parasitic mite syndrome or EFB is to do a mite wash. If you have a big number of mites, well, you know what the problem is. You can deal with it that way. What you can see in a colony with parasitic mite syndrome is bees dying at emergence, chewed down pupa, and chewed down pupa is not EFB. That's something else. But you can also encounter deformed wing virus expressions. Like this is deformed wing virus A and B present in this bee. Deformed wing virus A causes the melted wings appearance. Deformed wing virus B causes these shortened abdomens. And it's definitely something I keep an eye out for when I'm going through hives, especially towards the end of summer. So we can differentiate EFB from those other conditions. Again, you can see if it's parasitic mite syndrome by using a mite wash. You can use a lateral flow test device if available. They are still available for research and group purchases, which is something we're going to have to figure out going forward because the reality is we need these in the apiaries. What I'm usually doing, though, is using my eyes membrane deduction. Do we have cause to think these hives were sprayed or exposed to something to cause dysbiosis? Were they on a pollination contract where they got nailed by stuff? How many hives have it? If it's apiary-wide, I'm guessing it's something to do with a chemical exposure or food exposure. If it's pockets, I'm going to lean with EFB because I found EFB tends to have pockets in an apiary as opposed to the whole apiary. Is it persistent? If it was a chemical exposure, the bees will probably recover on their own given time. If it's sticking around, it's probably bacterial or viral inside that hive. And realize EFB is dysbiosis, but not all dysbiosis is EFB. But in my experience, generally speaking, if it looks like EFB, it is EFB. There are some more challenges in understanding Melissococcus. Like we know it causes European Foulbrood, but beyond that, our understanding is limited. It is seemingly short-lived. Seemingly is italicized for a reason there. It is hard to culture, and you need larvae that's barely sick to find it. However, as they've improved lab methods, they've found Melissococcus on equipment and in honey 12 months after the infection. The stuff sticks around much longer than we realized. Odds are we are using the wrong culture media. They didn't figure out how to grow it in a lab well till recently, and we're finding some more endemic issues with EFB sticking around in our hives than we realized. Hives with EFB in an apiary can be treated and recovered, but the EFB will reappear in other hives in the apiary. Your first hive got that disease from somewhere else, and you often cannot control where that disease is beyond your apiary, so you're always going to be subject to reinfection in that apiary. It's just understand if you have it show up once, it's going to show up again because it's in the region. Cause of infection spread in environmental wells are largely insufficiently explained. We really haven't researched this well. It might be something like staph, where you have asymptomatic colonies that have high amounts of the infection that can spread it to other colonies. We really don't know yet. That's just pet theories. Now, associated diseases. Sacbrood often appears with or before European Foulbrood in a hive, and this is a picture of some extreme Sacbrood. Now, if you look at that frame, you'll see roughly 90% of those cells are Sacbrood. I've only seen this in the past year, but I've seen it in 3 separate apiaries not managed by the same people. So this is an exciting new one we're going to have to keep an eye out for. Sacbrood is caused by a virus, and it's primarily spread through infected food to the larvae at the same age time as Melissococcus is. I personally think we might even have another thing instigating this, a stressor to the hive, or maybe even another primary infection we haven't yet identified that's making these bees susceptible to these infections. Something is going on that facilitates both of these happening. There's also snot or crud brood. These are pretty poorly described. It's kind of a late season melty brood condition, but you can also describe it as European Foulbrood but blank. The blank being wrong time of year, or the larvae are too old when they die, or any number of other things to say it's not European Foulbrood. But the reality is we should be calling these atypical European Foulbrood. That's a catch-all for things that look like EFB but are not textbook EFB. And here's why. While historically we couldn't identify Melissococcus in these edge cases, as lab methods have improved, we have. These are most likely different riffs on European Foulbrood, and we'll discuss why. The why is there's several different strains of European Foulbrood. Currently we've identified about 40 different strains that pool into 3 clonal families, and each one of these strains has its own riff and its own behaviors. Case in point, we say yellow is a pretty good indicator, that yellowing browning is a good indicator of EFB infection. Well, the problem is that's from a disease, from a chemical produced by Melissococcus tyramine. Well, there's some strains of Melissococcus that don't make it, and they never turn the larvae a different color. They just stay white through the entire infection cycle. Age of infection influences mortality rate, and virulence influences mortality rate. If your larvae gets infected towards the end of its infectious window, it's going to die at a later age, which can confuse people trying to identify the European Foulbrood because the larvae that's dying is older than they expect it to be. It can even be capped. It can be that far off differently. And we need to realize these are just variations on Melissococcus infections. Melty brood conditions, not due to PMS or brood abandonment, can and should be approached as Melissococcus caused. Some strains of Melissococcus are showing oxytetracycline resistance, that's terramycin. In the United States, the resistance, and Canada for that matter, the resistance is still below treatment thresholds, or treatment doses rather. So if you're using the prescribed treatment dose in your hive, you should still have effective Melissococcus control. That is not true in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, there are strains with total resistance to terramycin. The UK, again, their research on this is just impeccable. And they've identified and mapped different strains on their map here. And we notice like there's pockets, like there's this dark green pocket down here, but there's a couple of dark greens over here and a couple of dark greens up in the middle of the UK. And they can actually trace back the origin of some of these outliers to nuke cells from areas where it's endemic. So human intervention is definitely spreading this disease around, and we can expect that in the Americas as well. Now, what I've done to approach this is if I see European Foulbrood, Sacbrood, or Crud or Snot brood, because they're just so interrelated and they're both larval infections, what treats one will likely treat the other. I call this Melissococcus complex. MC diseases are not limited to spring and can be found well into August. The virulence can vary significantly. Like again, if you have one of those snot brood versions that just takes a lot longer to kill the larvae, it's going to look a lot different than the EFB that kills rapidly. Colonies with minor Sacbrood infections can recover, but the Melissococcus itself seems to appear a persistent infection. EFB will kill colonies in less than 6 weeks. It can. The majority will struggle along until something else comes along and kills them. Like they don't really make honey, so they tend to starve out in the winter without intervention. But the bottom 2 things are the most important points about this. Larvae are the most susceptible to the infection. That's who gets infected. That's who develops the huge titers of the infection. Most of the disease is in the larvae. So if you get rid of the larvae, you get rid of the disease. Now, there's been a sea change in how we deal with this. It used to be we would just get terramycin and blast the hive 3 times, and it would be good. Problem is, in 2017, a rule came into enforcement that you needed a veterinary visit and a script for it. Those are hard to get, so terramycins become unavailable for most of us. And the shelf life for terramycin is just about 3 years. It decomposes rather rapidly. So all the terramycin people stockpiled 7 years ago before the rule was in place is degrading. And we know the byproducts of that decomposition cause renal failure in humans. We can probably expect similar complications using it on bees. So if you're using tetracycline, it needs to be current. Now, let's talk about the treatment approaches we have on the whole. Again, there's the tetracycline if you can get it. Some people include a shake and swarm with that, where you shake the bees onto foundation and cull all of the old equipment. That is highly effective. Again, can't get oxytetracycline in most cases, so we're not going to focus on that too much. So let's focus on what we can do, and that is the extended brood break. 98% of the infection with Melissococcus is in the sick larvae. So if you get rid of the larvae, you've gotten rid of 98% of the infection. I achieved that through queen replacement and queen caging. This has been a practice for 110 years before terramycin became commonly used and available. For queen replacement, I pinch the old queen, throw a virgin queen in there, and I let her do her thing. That usually gives you like a 2-week brood break effectively. And the colony tends to come roaring back with that new queen. They do excellent when they recover that way. You can't always get virgin queens, and you can't always get virgin queens mated. In those instances, I will cage the queen for 2 weeks. 2 weeks is the sweet spot. If you do it for less than 2 weeks, there tends to be too much Melissococcus still in the hive and it reinfects. If you cage more than 2 weeks, the bees have a tendency to kill the queen. So you have to thread the needle there. I have found the 2-week caging is about 70% effective. So 7 times out of 10, the hive will recover without problems. 3 times out of 10, the EFB will reappear. That said, the queen replacement with a virgin, super effective. Super duper effective. Highly recommended. In the UK, they only have 2 methods they allow at this point. They've abandoned terramycin because, again, they have strains that are totally resistant to it. They have the shake and swarm method and destruction. However, the shake and swarms only used 10% of the time. 90% of the time, they're burning hives in the UK. And that's a very aggressive approach they have chosen to take, and that is not reflected by beekeeping in the Americas. We have a very different approach. And Megan Milbrath has this excellent slide in her presentation. There's no treatment that is recommended for everyone. And it comes down to how likely are your bees to become reinfected. If you keep bees on an island, and you have that one hive with EFB, well, if you burn that hive and get rid of it, you can eradicate that disease from your island and you're good to go. The majority of us are not keeping bees on an island. The majority of us have other beekeepers around us. We have feral hives in the woods around us. We have swarms we're launching from our hives that are no longer controlled afterwards around us. There will always be reinfection. You cannot eradicate the disease. So it becomes a game of minimizing the disease and controlling it when it shows up. And that's a very different set of skills to use. That's using the brood breaks to shut it down and stall it out. And permitting a little bit of background EFB to persist because it's endemic to where you are. This is the slide from the National Bee Unit on their burning versus shaken swarms. Again, only 10% of colonies get the shaken swarm. 90% of them are burned. If it's a weak colony, if it's heavily infected, or if it's not early enough in the year for the colony to recover, they're going to burn that thing. And I must admit some apprehension about this, because if the UK, if they're burning hives over there, they probably got a good reason to have come to that conclusion. They tend to be more on the ball as beekeepers than we are, so that's something to watch and see what goes on there. But that is not the status quo in the States. The status quo here is terramycin or brood breaks. And increasingly, it's going to be only brood breaks. Now, what can we do to prevent Melissococcus problems in our hives? Well, there's inspections and management. You got to get into these hives and find out if somebody's sick. And if they're sick, you got to deal with them. You either have to recover that colony in place by, caging that queen and getting rid of the brood, or you got to cull that thing, solarize it, burn it, whatever you're going to do, get rid of it. If it collapses before cull, It's going to get robbed, and that robbing is going to spread it to a bunch of hives, and you have a bunch more hives sick with EFB afterwards. You want to use biosecurity practices. If you take a frame from a sick hive that has sick larvae on it and give it to a healthy hive, now you have 2 sick hives. It is super infectious. You need to watch out spreading the disease through what you're doing. That includes trucking sick nukes from apiary to apiary. That includes using a hive tool that you've just worked through a hive full of EFB. Well, that hive tool now has the Melissococcus stuff on it. You can disinfect that hive tool or swap it out for another one. You can change gloves after going into one of these hives, which I would highly recommend. There's also reducing drifting. And there's a couple of things we can do to reduce drifting. We all kind of love the idea of all of our hives looking the same and being in a straight row. That's terrible for drifting. It causes problems. You should have the hives with landmarks and visual breaks between them, and different colors will help the bees get back to their home colony. Bees tend to drift from center hives to end hives. They can identify some colors well. The UK, the National Beekeeping people say they recognize the entrance better than they actually recognize the color above it. So I'm going to start painting my entrances to see what happens there. That's a new one on me. But break up your colony stands to where the bees can use landmarks and stuff and reduce the amount of drifting you have. Do realize sick bees are far more likely to drift than healthy bees. This is true for Israeli acute paralysis virus. It's true for Varroa infections. I'm willing to bet it's true for European Foulbrood infections. Now, equipment management. One of the things I didn't say, but I don't want to burn equipment I don't have to because equipment is expensive. Equipment is my biggest hang-up in beekeeping. So if I don't have to get rid of equipment or the bees, I'm not going to because the costs are huge. In terms of when to cull stuff, with Sacbrood, if it's got more than 10% Sacbrood on a frame, get rid of that frame. In fairness, I use a 2% threshold. I'm more comfortable with that. If I see a lot of Sacbrood on a frame, it's going out. That said, European Foulbrood and Snotbrood tends to be brood nest wise, so you have to cull the entire brood nest to get rid of it. That's too costly. The best place for this infected equipment is in an infected hive, because if you recover that hive, if you do your brood break or your terramycin or whatever, and get that hive back to healthy, well, that equipment is back to healthy, and you can use that without concern elsewhere in your apiary. Equipment with active infections are highly infectious. If it's got sick larvae on it, it's radioactive, man. Don't put it in another hive. Even the honey will have Melissococcus in it. When I have to remove equipment with active infections, you have to isolate it. What I do is I freeze it to kill off any of the moth and small hive beetle larvae and everything else, and then I store it in my basement sealed, and I leave it there until the next year. And while it's sitting there, to an extent, I can expect that bacteria to be breaking down because it doesn't have its host in there. So it's just the background stuff. And as time goes on, that number goes down and goes down. Its propensity for reinfecting a hive goes down. That's what I do with equipment when I have to get it off of hives. Now, one last bit on equipment management. Comb culling is a good practice. I try to keep my stuff as long as I can, but there is a practical limit on where you need to get rid of comb. It does remove a lot of disease pressure on a hive, getting rid of old comb. The recommendations are usually year-based. I think 5 years is probably the most common recommendation at this point. But the reality is, comb wear and tear can be highly variable depending where that comb is in a hive. Like a honey super can probably last more or less forever. But a frame on the outside of the brood nest is going to last a lot longer than a frame in the middle of a brood nest. So I actually inspect the comb and make decisions about the individual combs themselves rather than using a number to guide me. When I pull the comb out, I ask myself, is the comb heavy? Are the cell walls thick from all the pupal cocoons that are stuck in there? Are the cell openings shrinking from all the pupal cocoons? That's a great frame to get rid of or put in a swarm box because that'll entice that swarm colony to move into it, and you're not at a loss if you lose it. Is the frame pollen bound? You'll occasionally in my region find a frame full of brick red pollen the bees obviously aren't using, and that's dead equipment. They've abandoned it because it's either bad pollen in there or they know something's wrong with it, so get it out of your hives. And lastly, do we think the comb is chemically contaminated? If you're doing watermelons, you're getting nailed by all sorts of chemicals. If you're doing organic and you're in the woods and not around anything, well, it's not going to be chemically contaminated for a long while besides whatever you put in that hive. So you can use your judgment there. If you're in a migratory operation doing pollination, you're getting nailed all the time. You're going to have more contamination issues. You're going to have to cull comb more frequently to stay ahead of these problems. So in summary, Melissococcus plutonius establishes in an area, and that includes the entire Ohio Valley and the South, the old South. It's everywhere, guys. It's endemic. These diseases can present differently in each apiary and hive based on which strains of the virus or which strains of the bacteria they have and the secondary infections they have. Melissococcus is far more persistent than expected, but long-term viability on equipment is unknown. Comb culling can head off issues. Beekeeper must be able to differentiate between Melissococcus problems and non-Melissococcus caused problems. Oxytetracycline is very difficult to acquire. We must use the other treatment methods, and those come down to brood breaks, being shaken swarms, queen cage, and queen replacement. And lastly, we desperately need more research on this subject because, again, it's affecting 60% of hives in Michigan. This is a huge economic cost that's hitting our hives right now. This is not a theoretical problem. This is a right now problem. And this next slide is where I would usually open up for questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the comments. There are a lot of references I used in this presentation because it is a science-heavy one. I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. If so, click like and subscribe. That is what tells the algorithm to share my content with other beekeepers. And with that, I'll say good luck and happy beaking.